with this webinar. We have all of our panelists here and people are logging on steadily. Good evening and good morning, or whatever time it is. I hope everybody has their morning coffee or their evening water. We have registrants from all regions of the world, from Australia, from Asia, the Pacific, Africa, Europe, and North America. And we've just passed 6:30 p.m. Adelaide time. So thank you and welcome to all for joining the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide for this special webinar to launch the findings of a global opinion survey on rethinking special and differential treatment, or SDT, in the World Trade Organization. My name is Keith Wilson and I'm the Senior International Trade Law Counsellor at IIT. The first thing I should do is to acknowledge that the land on which I'm participating today and on which the University of Adelaide's campuses of North Terrace, the Waite and Roseworthy are built is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We recognise at the University of Adelaide the ancient and continuing spiritual relationship with country, and that the cultural and heritage beliefs of the Kaurna people are still as important to living Ghana today. I also acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders taking part in this webinar and pay my respects to the cultural authority of First Nations and Indigenous peoples attending from other areas in Australia and indeed around the world. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers today on this very relevant and important topic. Ambassador Xiangchen Zhang, who's the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and Professor Peter Draper, the Institute for International Trade's Executive Director and Acting Director of the university's new School for Economics and Public Policy, as well as to everyone participating virtually today. I'll introduce our speakers more fully shortly, and Ambassador Zhang will first make some scene-setting remarks, to be followed by Professor Draper, each for about 10 minutes. And this will allow time for questions from our audience and final remarks, with the event planned to conclude in 1 hour, so we'll keep to time. Just a couple of quick housekeeping matters. First, for the question and answer session, there is an icon for the latter part of this webinar at the bottom. Feel free to ask your questions via the Ask Question link in the Zoom window. And we will try to get to all of them, but if your question is not able to be answered, we will endeavour to get back to you. And the second important thing is to let you know that this event is being live streamed and recorded for later release on our website. Which now brings me to the topic for our discussions today, which is the release of a report and working paper authored by Professor Draper, together with Ziad Ibrahim and Lisa Hunt from the Institute. And Lisa and Ziad have registered. Lisa's with us also and is available to respond on issues relating to particular data and so on. The report represents the culmination of research undertaken by the Institute on SDT in the WTO. And the aim of the research is to enhance understanding of key SDT issues and address the different perspectives of the key international trade policy stakeholders in government, the private sector, international organizations and civil society. Where the value lies is in the report, its significant level of detail and nuance, which is reporting on areas that have always been a contested and complicated area in terms of expectations and outcomes in WTO negotiations. However, it needs to be emphasized at the outset that this study is not intended to provide negotiating options or to anchor negotiations in the WTO based on the findings. At the same time, it's well noted in the report that SDT is a long-standing framework and a shared understanding undertaking involving the entire WTO membership, with SDT provisions being firmly embedded in the WTO treaty. So that's my legal 2 cents worth. I don't otherwise wish to encroach on the more detailed remarks that our speakers will make, but I'll just observe that at the macro level, the report reflects a very in-depth quantitative and qualitative study of more than 300 survey responses from stakeholders from 63 countries at all levels of development across 5 key stakeholder groups, sectors, as well as qualitative interviews from a representative sample of public and private sector representatives from various developing and least developed countries. My 30 seconds worth. What stands out to me from the report is that there are many areas of commonality, together with a wide range of specific examples, differences reported by the different stakeholders. And these arise, as the report is structured, from 7 core themes, leading to findings on 5 sets of policy issues, and they result in 10 key insights. So that 7, 5, 10 is the structure of the report. And ultimately, it grapples with big issues. What is the meaning of development? The obligations arising from system participation, the contours of the changing political economy of trade, and as part of this more nuanced analysis in the study, the variety and the strength of the perceived benefits and risks. And one of the interesting observations in relation to a number of issues is the diversity in sectoral perceptions, particularly, and I note this, between government and organisational stakeholders on the one hand, and private sector trading representatives and academic respondents on the other, noting that these latter groups were somewhat underrepresented in the LDCs, which had a large number of government representatives. There also remain differences between countries at different levels of development, as you'd expect, but to varying degrees depending on the issue. So unsurprisingly, free riders prefer the status quo, but there's a wide-ranging support for reform, clarification, improvement where possible, monitoring, the use of models, and the allocation of resources and support. So please post your questions at any time. They may relate to any of the identified themes, which include issues of equity, eligibility criteria, market access predictability, flexibilities, balance of obligations, and the future of plurilaterals. Or it could be about specific issues of local content requirements, infant industry protection, graduation, and so on. So first, I'd like to introduce our initial speaker, who's WTO Deputy Director General, Ambassador Xiangchen Zhang, who's formerly served as a Vice Minister in the Ministry of Commerce in China. He has long and extensive experience on WTO issues, international negotiations, and policy research. Ambassador Zhang served until recently as China's permanent representative to the WTO and previously as Deputy Permanent Representative. He's had an extensive career of more than 30 years in international trade, serving as Director of the Department of International Trade and Economic Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation, as Director General of the Department of WTO Affairs of the Ministry of Commerce, and as Director General of the Department of Policy Research of the Ministry of Commerce. Ambassador Zhang holds a bachelor's degree in law, a master's degree in international relations, and a PhD in international politics from Peking University. Excellency, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Professor Draper and participants in today's webinar. I'm delighted to have been invited to launch the global survey on rethinking special and differential treatment in the WTO that the Institute for International Trade has conducted. The WTO has a long association with the Institute, and we have periodically sent some of our officials to spend time in Adelaide. Also, the research that has been done is very contextual. We're now just a week away from the start of WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, and the issues related to special and differential treatment underpin many of the discussions in different areas. But before I talk more about the research paper and its findings, let me very briefly put down the historical background of special and differential treatment in the WTO. acknowledgement of the special needs of developing countries and the imperative of providing them some flexibilities has been with us right from the time that the global trade was governed by the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. In fact, Part 4 of Trade and Development, which many believe laid the foundation of special and differential treatment, was added to GATT in 1965. Provisions in this section acknowledged that there was a need for positive efforts designed to ensure that less developed contracting parties secure a share in the growth in international trade commensurate with the need of their economic development. However, special and differential treatment, as we now know, it came into being during the Uruguay round. The WTO agreement that adopted in 1995 had 130 all the special and different treatment provisions, which endeavored to provide support and flexibilities to developing and least developed members to help them ease into multilateral trading system. While the number of special and differential treatment provisions was large, the language in which many of them were couched didn't prove to be very effective. As a result, and based on the concerns expressed by a large group of developing countries, a work program which called on members to review all the special and differential treatment provisions with a view to making them more precise, effective, and operational, was launched at the Doha Ministerial meeting in 2001. The Committee on Trade and Development in special session has been facilitating this discussion among members, a discussion which has seen only limited progress so far. In the last few years, the discussions have been guided by a set of 10 agreement-specific proposals, which the G90, the group of Africa, LDC, and ACP countries, has submitted. At the same time, some aspects of this debate have transcended into a realm of general counsel, where submissions have been made from both sides. The United States, through its submission, proposed certain conditions that would exclude members from declaring themselves as developing countries, including, for instance, membership of OECD or G20, or those countries that have more than a certain share of global merchandise trade. On the other hand, submissions by South Africa and India argue that special and differential treatment is an integral part of the multilateral trading system, that it is a treaty-embedded right, and that self-declaration of developing member status, a fundamental rule in the WTO, has proven to be the most appropriate classification approach. The main focus of the discussion, and which has also become a source of huge divergence, related to, first, the objective sought to be achieved through special and differential treatment. Second, the need to make special and differential treatment more targeted towards the countries that need it most. Third, whether special and differential treatment should be open-ended, or should its eligibility be linked to the achievement of certain development parameters. And fourth, the importance of not diluting the fundamental principle of special and differential treatment. Against this background, this report on special and differential treatment will, without any doubt, provide some very useful insights into this discussion. While the report states at the outset that it does not intend to provide negotiating options, nor does it seek to serve as an anchor for WTO negotiations, it is nevertheless a rigorous work that captures points of view that are not usually heard at the WTO. So I would like to stop here to listen to the insight and Professor Draper for his presentation on the study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zhang. As I'm speaking, Peter is loading some slides, and I'll just introduce Peter Draper, who is our Executive Director at the Institute for International Trade in the Faculty of Professions at the University of Adelaide. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Chamber of Commerce's Research Foundation. He's a non-resident senior fellow of the Brussels-based European Centre for International Political Economy, associated researcher at the German Development Institute, DIE, and a board member of the Australian Services Roundtable. In 2020, he co-chaired the Saudi Arabia-led Think 20's Task Force 1 on trade and investment. And for 10 years, he was respectively member, chair, vice chair, and co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the Global Trade and FDI System. He was also senior research fellow at the South African Institute for International Affairs, and previously he worked in South Africa's National Department of Trade and Industry in bilateral economic relations, and as head of the Economic Analysis and Research Institute in the department's International Trade and Economic Development Division. He's held a number of academic roles, including what is now University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he's a recipient of an honorary doctorate degree from the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena in Germany. Peter, over to you.
Thanks very much, Keith, and thanks very much, Ambassador Zhang, for those welcoming remarks and framing the context for us. I'm going to go through this at a fairly high level and quite quickly. The report will be made available after this webinar, just to preempt that question, and it will be made available through a hyperlink that we will send to participants in this webinar and beyond. So I think, Keith, you've already dealt with the objectives of the project, but basically we wanted to contribute to the conversation and to provide a bit more nuance to enable what we think should be proper understandings of the issues and where various parties are coming out on the many complex issues that pervade the SDT discussion. So we started with a desktop process, a literature review, as you would expect. We also analyzed the official proposals and statements made in the General Council of the WTO, and Ambassador Zhang referenced some of those. From that, we identified some core themes for further investigation, and then used those in a second phase to phrase the global opinion survey. And we specifically wanted to get the survey outside of, if you like, the Geneva bubble, where positions are deeply entrenched on this issue and, of course, a range of others. And so we wanted to get it into national capitals and get a sense, take the temperature, if you like, of the conversation, or at least views in those national capitals. And we also supplemented this with some qualitative interviews conducted virtually with stakeholders from 8 national capitals from different countries, developing countries particularly, around the world. So to sum up the key data, we received overall 302 responses, bearing in mind that this was a detailed survey and there were a number of complaints about the depth of the survey, but it took a good half hour to fill out. So we deeply thank everybody who did take the trouble to fill it out, representing about 63 countries and broken down according to LDCs, roughly a quarter, developing countries just under half, and developed countries just under 30%. So a reasonable spread across the WTO membership. If we then break down the profile of respondents, starting on the left-hand side, this is representing people based in national capitals. The Geneva proportion was very small, just about 4%. So mostly the survey results reflect views from national capitals. So we think we achieved that objective. And on this side, we're showing down how the stakeholder responses were stratified. So The majority, roughly a third, non-government organizations, just under a third again, or just over a quarter, private companies. So that was quite pleasing to get private sector perspectives. Intergovernmental organizations here, just under a quarter, and then government departments, just under 10%, and then academic institutions, the remainder. If we looked at the roles that the respondents occupy, largely a technical level respondents, so these are practitioners, if you like, of trade or trade policy, mostly at the senior and management levels, and some owners of companies as well, and largely quite an experienced group of people that filled this survey out. Overall, which is, I think, quite pleasing to see, respondents were in support of developing countries having access to special and differential treatment in some form, and we'll get to some of those nuances shortly. So for a lot of these slides, we break down the responses according to the different country categories. So in this particular one, it's least developed country respondents. This one is developing countries, and then developed countries on this side. The red is where they would strongly disagree with the statement. So in this case, 33% of developed country respondents disagreed with the idea that developing countries need SDT to fully participate in the system, but the majority either strongly agreed or agreed. So clearly a majority in support there. And we then look to break this down further by, and apologies, but my screen sharing is interfering with my view of my slides. But basically this just further shows, the structuring of the different stakeholder groups vis-a-vis support for SDT in the system. If I move then into the key insights, so Keith mentioned that there were 10. The rest of this presentation really follows on those key insights, and then provide some data points to contextualize them further. And bearing in mind that this is an opinion survey, so it's just taking the temperature of what people are thinking vis-a-vis any particular question or topic. So the first key insight that occurred to us as we went through the very rich data set is that the primary beneficiaries of SDT, being, we think, least developed countries, seemed most alive to the problems with the current system and hence the need for reforms. And we go into some of the contextual detail around where reforms could possibly focus later on in the report. So perhaps not surprisingly, those best placed to free ride, as Keith mentioned, and particularly developing country respondents, and I'm not saying all, but some developing country respondents, they are inclined to maintain the status quo because obviously they benefit from the status quo. Whereas again, not surprisingly, developed country respondents consistently favored reforming current approaches, and particularly through better targeting, including, for instance, the elaboration of objective qualifying, or if you like, quantitative criteria. And then the second key insight is that there was clear support across these different stakeholder categories, as well as country categories, for effective monitoring and evaluation of special and differential treatment. And that reflects, I think, this is my interpretation, the deeper sense that whilst many countries in principle benefit from special and differential treatment provisions, the nature of those benefits, the extent of those benefits is not well understood. So is the system really working for them? You may well ask the question. And so in response to the question, should all developing countries have the right to invoke SDT, so all developing countries, and so LDCs and developing, in order to secure special negotiating concessions? Not surprisingly, 80% of respondents from developed countries disagree, so they want to see conditions imposed on that access, whereas 45% of respondents from least developed countries disagree, and 42% of respondents from developing countries. And there's a few other charts in the report that go towards this particular issue. We also found, and I use the phrasing carefully here, qualified support for the establishment of objective criteria, such as quantitative indicators, and again, largely concentrated on developed country respondents, but by no means exclusively. Also, a number of LDC respondents made this observation too. But this is not necessarily a definitive result. And obviously in a sample of 302 opinions, that's a very small sample of global opinion on this topic, but it still was quite interesting to see this show up. Also interestingly, government officials that responded to this question were mostly in favor of retaining the status quo. Again, my interpretation could be, well, there's a couple of ways you could interpret this. One is maybe they understand the system best, but the other could also be that they're trapped, if you like, in the logic of negotiations and reciprocity. And so this is also regarded in that light. It's a negotiating coin, if you like, not to be given up lightly. And then key insight 4 is that there was clear support for providing specific, or if you like, tailored SDT that caters for the needs of LDCs and objectively qualifying developing country WTO members. And we specifically phrased the question that way. So if objective criteria could be established, would you support the provision of specific SDT to those qualifying developing country WTO members? And the answer was yes. And then obviously the next question is, what's the model for that? Well, everyone talks about the Trade Facilitation Agreement or the TFA as a potential model. So we asked our respondents about that. And there was strong support for the TFA as a model, but subject to greater clarity on how specifically aid for trade could better support its implementation. So this is just taking those insights and providing a bit more context across the different country groups. So again, 75% of respondents from least developed countries agree that we need more tailoring to specific country circumstances and to objectively qualify developing countries, and a similar proportion from developed countries, but less from developing. So slightly more skepticism, but still the majority supported the notion at least. And then if we break that down across the different stakeholder sectors, again, this bar here, about 70%, except for the non-government organization, largely reflects support for the tailoring approach. And I'm not quite sure why the NGOs were more skeptical about that, but that could be a topic for follow-up work. This slide is showing the support for the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and those numbers are pretty clear. They dropped off a bit in the case of developed countries, so more skepticism there. And since it's developed countries that provide generally the aid for trade, perhaps one could understand that skepticism. So what is our money going to be used for? Might be a question to be asked by developed country representatives. We also wanted to get a bit of context on specific areas of special and differential treatment. And so we asked questions around local content requirements, subsidies, and import duties as potential policy expressions for special and differential treatment. And we first started by asking, do you think that the WTO accords developing countries particularly sufficient policy space to implement these kinds of policies, assuming they thought it was a good idea? And there was clear support for that notion. So in other words, our respondents thought, yes, the WTO does provide sufficient policy space. But that's not a judgment on whether that's a good thing or not to do. There was also some support, because we asked respondents this question, for the idea of raising import duties as a form of accessing special and differential treatment. But a substantial majority acknowledged that this would cause self-harm to your own country. And this gets to the monitoring and evaluation issue, because what one might do as a monitoring and evaluation exercise is to look at those countries where import duties have been raised in the name of special and differential treatment, and then ask the empirical question, has this harmed you or not? And there is obviously a literature around that. A lot of research is conducted at an aggregate economic modeling level. So perhaps case studies, industry case studies in particular, even firm level case studies might supplement that literature further. We also wanted to get a sense, because this is a key issue in the Geneva debate, raised particularly by the US, but not only the US, whether certain developing countries, and you can put in brackets China, obviously, because that has been the prime US target, so to speak, whether they use special and differential treatment as a kind of a shield to hide their emerging industries behind. So they invoke it and then promote their globally competitive industries at the expense of their competitors. Now, when we phrased this question, I thought probably developed country respondents would be alert to this issue and would say, yes, this is a problem. But actually it turned out to be LDC representatives that thought this was a big problem in the system and for their exporters, presumably. But also some developing country respondents were concerned about that issue too. So this is further context on some of those key insights. Does the WTO provide sufficient policy space in the area of subsidies? Developed country respondents said absolutely. LDCs largely agreed. Developing countries were largely skeptical. Or developing country respondents, I should say. And then similarly, when it comes to import duties, there was a strong consensus, I would say, that the WTO does provide sufficient policy space, but some that disagreed, and particularly in LDCs. And this is the issue of, will SDT be used to promote globally competitive industries at the expense of competitors? And the concerns were really concentrated, I think, interestingly, in least developed country respondents, to a lesser extent developing countries, and then developed country respondents didn't seem to be too concerned about this issue, which I found interesting. Then key insight 7 confirms what we know, but still we wanted to ask the question. So how important are capacity constraints in accessing special and differential treatment, and what's the appropriate policy response? So clearly our respondents acknowledge that these are important capacity constraints, and that the way to respond to it is by simplifying the flexibilities available to developing countries to make them more accessible. But that also goes with the provision of resources, which is key insight 8. So respondents were in support of more resources for, again, objectively qualifying developing country members to make full use of the multilateral trading system. And then the kinds of support that they thought could be useful, largely technical assistance, and this was shared across those country categories, but also provisions like GSP, and we had some questions around that, although some skepticism of those amongst developed country respondents. And on the issue of policy flexibilities, policy space, if you like, developed country respondents were very skeptical, one could say. We also asked, as I mentioned, questions around the GSP scheme, and the big thing that emerged, again, not a surprise to those particularly academics that have followed this literature, but interesting still to see it confirmed, and particularly I think private sector correspondents or respondents confirmed this, that the simplified rules of origin in GSP schemes and more accessible, flexible rules of origin would be good to see. Delivering that, of course, is another matter entirely. And I can't actually see the heading of this slide, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move on to the end. And I think I'll conclude there, Keith, and happy to take questions and comments, of course, from the audience.
Thank you very much, Peter, and to both our speakers. And now this is the opportunity for all of those who are participating online to engage in a discussion while we have our panelists with us. There are already some questions I've received in the Q&A, and I have some others that I'd like to raise if I get the chance, but it depends very much on you. So on a procedural matter, one question is, are the slides able to be shared, or at least the key findings of the report? And Peter, I presume that the release of the report will be imminent.
Yeah, that's right, Keith. So we'll release a link to a web page that we're setting up, which will contain all of these materials. It may be that we send the link to the report first because we're still constructing that full web page. But yes, the materials will be made available and fairly soon.
Thank you. And when this webinar is published, the specific slides will be part of that webinar. They'll be visible in the publication. I'm glad to see I'm starting to get quite a few questions coming now, which is good. Thank you also. I join Peter in thanking the more than 300 stakeholders who responded to this very detailed survey of nearly 60 in-depth questions. And it was a classic example of no pain, no gain, because by responding in a nuanced way, we can come to a number of conclusions. However, I'd note that, with 60 questions, boiling it down to 10 key insights is a juggling act, and that relates to one of the questions that we've got, which indicates we've got an attendee who's paying very close attention to the report, because referring to key insight 2 and the idea of monitoring and what the consequences of monitoring would be, whether there'd be revocation or withdrawal of benefits. Is there a distinction between withdrawing benefits if they're not utilized appropriately, or should they be revoked if they're not effective, which are two different aspects? And the question is there evidence for this conclusion? Obviously not every slide and every graph is put up in this presentation, or is it a view that's been formed that's implied from insight 2?
So yes, we asked questions on that issue, and that is backed up in the report. So when the report is released, you'll be able to go through the very rich set of survey results, and there's some specifically on this issue. The policy conclusion to draw from this, that's open for debate. So in the report, we deliberately avoid trying to put our own conclusions on it. I think if you were to ask me my personal opinion, I think it can certainly go in the direction of establishing quantitative or objective criteria, and then monitoring and evaluating against those criteria. Clearly, that's one possible use. But also, it could just go in the direction of fine-tuning special and differential treatment provisions to make them more precise, operational, and effective. So, the precise usage of that insight, I think it's for WTO members to decide for themselves, but hopefully it will shed some more nuance on the debate.
I'll just give an opportunity for Ambassador Zhang to comment if he wishes, or I'll move on to the next set of questions.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Thanks, Professor Draper, for your very informative presentation, and thanks all participants for the very useful exchange. So let me share with you a few points of my observation on this research. The research provides us with some very interesting insights through a methodology that included a comprehensive review of the existing literature, the design and the application of opinion surveys, and qualitative interviews. Well, the survey results clearly showcased a strong support across all responses in favor of relooking at the current special and differential treatment system. There are significant differences on how this should be done. For instance, a large majority of the response from developed countries disagree with the proposition that the WTO members should have the right to self-designate themselves as developing. On the other hand, a large percentage of the response from developing countries and from IODCs felt that this was very important and an integral part of the rulemaking system. Interestingly, with regard to the survey question on whether WTO rules allow members sufficient policy space in the area of important duties to protect their domestic industries, response from all countries and sectors answered positively to the proposition, and they seem to agree that the countries had this policy space. However, significant difference persistent on a similar line of question concerning the use of local content requirement and the industry subsidies. Overall, it was encouraging to note that a large majority of the response was positive of the incorporation of a special and differential treatment into WTO agreements in order to fully integrate beneficiaries into the multilateral trading system. This clearly underpins the significance of special and different treatment in the WTO. The report concludes recommending that the untapped potentials of SDT could be uncovered by determining the status of developing country members based on objectively defined criteria. The authors believe that the self-designation principle creates uncertainty and is causing unnecessary conflict among the WTO membership. This is, however, an issue that generates very different response in Geneva's corridors. There's one small suggestion that I would like to make. There are not too many response from academic world and the business from developing countries and IODCs, just as you have done for the developed members. I think reaching out to more such respondents would give us a better view of what the non-government actors feel about special and differential treatment. So Professor Draper, on behalf of the WTO, I would like to commend you on this very interesting and deep analysis of the SDT issues in the framework of our organization. The views expressed therein are refreshing, and I'm sure will motivate members to look at the special and differential treatment question from a more macro perspective. From this perspective, the survey will be a very important addition to the literature that exists on this important but vexed issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. I'm just going to group, there's a set of questions for Peter, which are basically the same issue around the sample size and criteria. There were 3 different types of country in 5 stakeholder categories or sectors with more than 300 respondents. The question is, how were the respondents identified and selected? What was the criteria? And how significant are the differences in responses? And one of the people who asked those questions has put in the chat room for everybody this observation that there are significant differences between the company responses and many of the other groups. Peter.
Sure, thanks Keith. So, because this was a global survey, we wanted it to be global, targeting people or respondents was always going to be an impossible exercise. And I must say that, if we had the resources of the World Bank or the OECD or pick another international organization, we could have done a sophisticated targeting exercise using our infrastructure around the world. But as a small institute based in Adelaide with a small budget, that's just not possible. So what we did is we made use of our own databases, so both the Institute's database, our LinkedIn profiles, our partners that we work with in various countries and regions, and we ask them to send it around. So we worked our network. That's essentially how we got word out there that this survey was being conducted. Many partners did share it. And that's, if you like, within the trade community networks. Now, we work in both developing and developed countries, and we had, frankly, to luck that we would get a good spread of country respondents, which I think we did in the end, get a very good spread of country respondents. So I hope that answers the question on the construction of, well, the targeting in inverted commas. We also, as I mentioned, conducted qualitative interviews in 8 developing countries. And my colleague Lisa Hunt, who's in the background on this call, conducted those and can speak to those if there's interest in it.
Thank you, Peter. There is a comment thanking you for a very insightful study, and just on that criteria and the sample size, asking how many countries in the study were from Africa. I'll cover for you, Peter. I just did a back of the envelope count from table 1 in the report, and I think there were 19 of the 63 countries were from Africa. Now we're getting into some more specific questions, and at the end of your presentation, the last slide, Peter, was on participation in plurilaterals, but that wasn't discussed in detail in your presentation. Could you say a word or two about your findings?
Oh, yes. In essence, there was pretty strong support for the need for plurilaterals to be incorporated in the WTO system in some form. So in the survey, we didn't get into the details as to how that could look. But if anybody's interested, tomorrow night we're running another webinar on how we think developing countries could be better included in plurilaterals. So that's not based on a survey. That's based on a policy brief that we, myself and a few co-authors, wrote for the Think 20. That was published by the Italian presidency recently. So that's an editorial for tomorrow night's webinar. But in essence, across the country groups, respondents supported the notion that plurilaterals should be part of the system and an important part of the system.
Thank you, Peter. So the next group of questions is about, the way forward. There's a comment in the chat from Richard Douglas Kamara from South Africa, who does research in this area, who is convinced that the multifaceted challenges for WTO members could be addressed through a collaborative approach. And then in the questions, we've got some questions about the Geneva debate being so politicized. What do we think the way forward is? Or more bluntly, given that Geneva is consensus-based, how to convince stakeholders who oppose reform? Are there new coalitions being formed between LDCs and developed countries, for example? There could be different crossovers.
So that's a great question, and we don't explore that in the report. So if you like, the political economy of this is highly vexed, as we know, and as Ambassador Zhang spelled out for us. What the precise deadlock breaking mechanisms are in the Geneva context, I will admit, frankly, is beyond me. But that said, I do think that there's merit to thinking beyond Geneva. And that's why we wanted to take the survey to capitals, to gauge the temperature across the world, if you like, in the trade policy community. And that's where a lot more nuance emerges. And that tells you, if you take it out of the Geneva context, perhaps you could get more reason, perhaps, into the debate, less entrenched negotiating positions. And then other groupings, potentially the G20, who knows, maybe the UN, pick your forum, might be better avenues for pursuing a more collaborative approach and to actually solving the issues, maybe.
Thank you, Peter. So if I could just introduce on that point of the way forward, I noticed in the report that at various points, it appears that the starting point for different stakeholders is often very different, but the the agreement on the value of certain outcomes starts to converge. The difference, developed countries emphasize STT as a stepping stone, so to full participation, to graduation and so on. It's a conceptualization of it being a linear process, whereas many of the developing countries and LDCs look at as a tool for development, for level playing field in negotiations, or to protect domestic interests. So is part of the issue that it's almost that different languages are being spoken as we enter the discussion, even if this study shows that it's more complex than that?
Yeah, I think that's right, Keith. And if you flip it around, the obvious question is when should a country stop qualifying for these benefits? And I presume that the answer is when it becomes developed. Now, that necessarily implies a graduation path. Now, whether we want to objectively quantify that is obviously at the heart of the Geneva debate. My personal view is that I don't think you can escape that logic. That ultimately the objective of special and differential treatment is to help to deliver development, and then ultimately you become developed. Therefore, you must graduate from special and differential treatment once you join the developed country club. So there needs to be an endpoint. I think that's just logical. Quite how you construct that is at the heart of the debate, I think.
Thank you. For everybody attending, there was a request to share the link for registration in tomorrow's webinar that Peter mentioned on plurilaterals and developing country participation. And thank you to Lydia, she's posted that link for anybody who wishes to register. And now the questions move on to some of the questions around asymmetries. So this brings in the whole question of technical assistance in building negotiation skill and knowledge, in being able to capacity building to be able to take advantage of STT and so on, and the challenges in leveraging that type of assistance. So either panelist have an observation on that.
Maybe Ambassador Zhang.
Hello, Keith.
Yes, hello.
I would like to make a comment on that. I think this is the very important point that there's an asymmetry between the developing countries and developed ones in the WTO, especially the LDCs. So the key words of the special and different treatment is to address the capacity constraint. But at this moment, this issue I think is overlooked. So we need to pay attention to the suggestion and the response from the survey that we need to work out tailor-made technical assistance program for the developing country who need assistance. So the assistance is to help the developing country to better integrate into the multilateral trading system. It's a positive instrument. It's not, a way to help them to stop or to create a criteria for them to benefit from the multilateral trading system. So I think in the future WTO reform, the tailor-made technical assistance program should be integral part of that. So that's my comment on this.
Thank you. Now we have some more specific questions. So thank you for this interesting webinar. In the current JSI e-commerce negotiating text, there's a provision under data flows that creates a self-judging clause to benefit developing countries and LDCs. They would be able to put in place any measures concerning data flows that they consider appropriate. In regional trade agreements, the only self-judging clause on data flows is related to national security. That's in RCEP. What is your assessment about this sort of self-judging clause, and what is the chance that that is accepted by developed countries?
So that's a question to Miki.
Yes, to Peter.
Yeah. Well, SDT in its entirety is self-judging currently, and I think, as I've said, my own view is that we need to move progressively towards objective criteria, some combination of qualitative and quantitative. And I think that's where the work is likely to go in the future. But also the concept of graduation, I think, is important. Now, I'm not involved in the details of the e-commerce negotiations, but I would personally be skeptical of a self-judging clause that is so wide that in essence, a country can do whatever it feels like without any kind of, if you like, sell-by date on that action. So there needs to be some pathway towards full incorporation into that agreement. And that points towards the broader SDT issue of, well, graduation pathways, but also phasing in of full commitments over time. Now, what the precise magic is for the e-commerce negotiation, given all the other complexities of that particular negotiation, I can't say, but hopefully that sets out some of the broad parameters of the issue.
Did you wish to add to that, Ambassador Zhang?
I understand Professor Draper and his colleague suggest that maybe in the future we can explore some objective criteria for developing countries. But this is my observation in Geneva. It's very difficult to reach any definition on any issue among the diplomats. That's the reality. And so we have no definition on trading services. We have no definition on e-commerce or digital trade. So for the developing country, I think it's even more difficult for the members to reach any consensus on the criteria. So of course, I encourage you, Professor Draper and your colleague, to continue to do this research. But from the political perspective in Geneva, I don't think in the near future there's the hope for the members to reach consensus on those objective criteria. So the pragmatic way to address issue is to encourage the members of the developing countries who are in the position to make more contribution. If that's the case, for example, the emerging countries like China, like India, like Brazil, they make more contribution in the existing negotiations. So this issue can be unlocked politically. So on this basis, we can continue our discussion from a more broader perspective and more systemic way. So that's my observation. Thank you.
So Keith, one thing to add to that is that I think it's also for the foreseeable future, a negotiation by negotiation or sector by sector approach that makes sense to embed these kinds of considerations into particular JSIs, such as e-commerce and also others, rather than hope for overarching graduation criteria or objective criteria. That I agree with Ambassador Zhang is politically probably too toxic in the current Geneva context.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our hour. There's one more question in my feed, and it's an interesting one because I observed a statement in the report about the respondents did not see SDT as necessarily being incongruent with domestic economic reform, even though there's often a perception that SDT might become like a race to the bottom or be internationally uncompetitive or not benefit consumers. There were shared different views on those things. And the question is about could the economic advantages of low wage countries not being questioned be a form of SDT, particularly when nations fail to adhere to ILO consensus? And doesn't that encourage a race to the bottom to keep wages low? Now, I suppose the rider to that is if trade agreements are intended to be trade enhancing, where do we sit in terms of whether things are a race to the bottom or a race to the top or a race to an agreed outcome?
Yeah, so the wage issue is interesting. That's an expression of comparative advantage, and the trade economist in me would not confuse it with special and differential treatment. I think they're analytically two separate issues.
Yes. Thank you. Well, it is 7:30. There are many more questions I'm sure people have, and thank you to everybody who participated online, and thank you particularly to our speakers, Ambassador Zhang and Professor Draper. I hope many of you will join us there's a webinar tomorrow on plurilaterals. We also have a webinar on relations with the Pacific region on Thursday at lunchtime Australian time, for those of you who would wish to join that, and we'll be back for that one. But there is a great deal of richness and depth in this report, and for those of you who receive copies of it, I recommend it to you to read the detail, because it's very interesting in terms of the different responses from different groups. Thank you to all for participating. Are there any final comments that our panelists would like to make in farewell?
Nope.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Professor Draper. I encourage you to continue your research, and we are expecting the meaningful discussion on the special and different treatment after MC12.
Thank you.
Thank you all. So something to people to take away, and we may have to respond to this offline. There's a question about whether we think design thinking and design strategy could be a focus in trade negotiations between different countries. As I said, this paper was not intended to be a basis for negotiations, but that's a thought that one of our participants has thrown into the mix. Thank you very much to everybody, and we'll see you at our next webinar. And good night and good morning.